podium don't need any introduction, but I'm going to do it quickly anyway. We have Professor Barry Friedman, who has a really fancy title at NYU. He is obviously the director of the Policing Project. I urge you all to go on their website and take a look at what they do. The Policing Project is a grassroots, community-focused, hands-on organization focused on police reform and democratic governance and policing. And Barry's been leading the way since he founded that institute some years ago. In addition, of course, we have Vikrant Reddy, who is an absolute star. He's a leading voice, a very perceptive, thoughtful voice in criminal justice reform. He is a senior research fellow at the Stand Together Trust, and a senior researcher at in the criminal executive position at the Federalist Society. In addition, he works in Texas, where he has been a leading voice in criminal justice reform at the Texas Public Policy Institute, for example, and contributing extensively to national debate. So we are so very lucky to get this conversation started and be moderated by our very own superstar, Professor Slobogin, who needs no introduction, obviously. So do you want one? Would you like one? Okay, great. So let's just get that started. Professor Slobogin, to kick us off.
Thanks, Yesha. I think I needed to drink more coffee. I don't have that kind of energy level. But it's absolutely great.
So far.
Yeah. I'll cut you off. Great to have Barry Belton here, talking about police in the United States. I think it's fair to say with the murder of George Floyd and the numerous other well-documented accounts of those shooting and killing citizens, a disproportionate number of them people of color, that policing has received more attention in the last couple of years than it ever has in this country. I teach a course on regulation of police, and there's no doubt the police have been more focused on issues of their power in the last couple of years than ever in the 25 plus years of teaching. Of course, there's been a lot of talk about reforming the police, not just in terms of use of deadly force, but in terms of their training, in terms of their funding, whether they should be handling low-level offenses and traffic infractions, technology, and a number of other topics like that. I think it's also fair to say that the reform movement is somewhat visible. There have been significant changes in some jurisdictions at the federal level and in many states. Remember that what I'd like to get both Barry and Vikrant to talk about first is what reforms, if any, do you think are crucial, and why is it so hard to get the ball rolling? Why don't we start with Barry?
Thank you, Chris. It's great to be here. I don't know if any of you know this, but I taught here for 14 years, so it's always great to be back to a place I consider home. Vikrant and I work together on many things. We don't agree on everything, but we are partners in many ways and stand together for us. Has been a great supporter of the Policing Project. Chris and I have worked together on American Law Institute project on principles of policing. Yesha and I are writing about privacy protections around government collective information. Fortunately, when we work together, our energy levels are a little bit more synced than they have to be right at this very moment. So I'm going to dig in. The founding principle of the Policing Project and the core of a book I wrote called Unwarranted draws an important distinction that I want to draw now that explains why, if the movement hasn't fizzled, there's so much more work to be done. So I had a realization many years ago when I was teaching constitutional law and criminal procedure in the same semester, and was really struck by the fact that it was weird. The same Constitution governed both of those things, and yet the rules were completely different. And that's when a light bulb went off in my head, which was that most of government, when we talk about accountability, what we're talking about is having statutes and rules and regulations that are adopted up front, what we call the Policing Project, the front-end accountability, that tell government actors what we expect out of them. And we don't do that with policing. With policing, when you see one tragedy after another, and people talk about accountability, they're talking about something completely different, what we call back-end accountability, which is that they want prosecutions, civil rights actions, federal monitors, even body cameras are a form of back-end accountability, which is to say, let's figure out who did something wrong and hold them responsible. But what's wrong in policing and what needs to change is that we need front-end accountability. We need to actually have legislation that tells the police what's expected of them. And after George Floyd's murder, for the first time, we started to get that legislation, but it's been pinpricked. So many places banned chokeholds, but they did not comprehensively address use of force. And there's too many examples. We talk about no-knock warrants, but we don't talk about search protocols more generally. And so one of the things we do with the policing project is we draft legislation and try to move it in the states and at the federal level, though the federal level is pretty pathetic right now. Because I think unless and until we actually regulate policing like we regulate the rest of society, and there's much more that we need to do beyond that, we're not going to make the progress that needs to be made.
Ron? Social reforms, if any, why do you think it's been so hard to get, why do you think it's been so hard to get the ball rolling in terms of reforming the police?
I guess the reason things are so hard to get the ball rolling is because there's just so many different things that need to be done. And there's so many different parts of the system that are governed by different entities. And it's not one of these things where you could just pass one piece of legislation and be done with the problem. It's also, I think, it's just a reality that policing in America is tied into really deep social pathologies in American history. And those are the kinds of things that you just can't untangle by, once again, by signing a piece of legislation. You know, this is kind of the obvious thing that everyone understands I'm talking about is racism in American history, right? We've had this big debate over institutional and structural racism I was about to say ever since George Floyd's killing, but really it goes back further than that for several years. I've always thought that those are useful terms. They don't explain everything. And I think in some ways the terms are abused. There are people who will use those terms simply to say that person is racist. And that's not really what those terms mean. What those terms mean, as I understand them, is that there are certain elements of our history that are fueled by racial animus, and that animus has kind of gone into our system and into our institutions. So that all sounds really abstract. So let me give you like just a very simple example. I think everybody here would understand. There were folks in the mid 80s who were very concerned about the problem of drugs in school zones, near schools, because you don't want them to be near kids. You don't want drugs to be sold to kids. Now, the solution to this problem was, well, let's figure out some area, 500 feet, 1,000 feet of a school, within 500 or 1,000 feet of a school, and let's amplify the penalty for people who sell drugs in this area. Now, if you grow up in a place like I did, suburban Fort Worth, Texas, that's fine. There's nothing within 500 or 1,000 feet of the school, just soccer fields, baseball fields, But if you grow up in downtown Baltimore, or Chicago, or Los Angeles, places like this, that's just an apartment complex across the street. That's the laundromat, that's the drugstore, that's just where people live. And so the person is not necessarily trying to sell to children, but they get caught up in this penalty enhancement. And it's particularly going to affect African-American communities, because who lives in these downtown urban centers as a reality of racism in American history and migratory patterns and where people were permitted to live and not permitted to live. And I think the people who think about these kinds of laws don't say, well, let's do X in order to get at the African-American community in this way. But they don't realize that that is what they are doing. And untangling all of that kind of stuff would that would mean untangling just where people live in the United States. That kind of thing is very, very difficult. So it's an incredibly complicated problem.
Very good, Jen.
Got it. Sorry about that.
That's good.
So Yesha, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, so one of the debates that has come up recently has been in relation to thinking about ways to reduce the funding for policing, the sort of defund the police movement or de-policing. What are your thoughts on how you respond to calls for defunding the police or reducing funding for the police? What are your reactions to that debate and that movement?
That's good answer first.
So first of all, I guess it sort of depends on what you mean by defund, right? And a lot of people seem to mean a lot of different things, but just for the sake of putting it out there, there was a very prominent New York Times op-ed, which was titled something like, "I really mean defund the police. Stop giving police money and get rid of policing." That is just simply incorrect. We should talk about what we know and what we don't know. What we know as a matter of social science research is that as you put more police out on the streets, you get more public safety. Crime rates go down. That is one of the most robust findings in all of social science. You're not going to find many serious people who dispute that. Now, having said that, there are a lot of caveats to offer. The first major caveat I would offer is that when you say more policing equals more public safety, you're not really in a position to talk about the costs. What are the costs of more policing? You have more police out there, you'll inevitably get more police abuse. You'll get mistrust in policing as an institution. You may get just broader mistrust in all American institutions, period. I mean, there are a lot of serious costs that aren't taken into account when you just say more cops, more safety. The other thing I would say is, why does it work? We don't have a good sense of that. I think there's an impulse to say, well, the reason it works is that all the cops go and arrest all the bad guys. That is very simplistic. And in fact, there was a recent study that showed that even as you put more police out on the streets, the number of arrests actually go down. So what seems to be happening there is that it would call into question the entire idea of, quote, bad guys. It's not that there are bad guys. There are people who may have bad impulses from time to time, but if they know that they're being seen, they won't act on those impulses. And then the final thing that I would note is that you do get diminishing returns to just flooding the zone with cops. You know, if you kind of think about this mathematically, if you have X number of cops out there, then you get Y amount of public safety. That's not always going to be X gets you Y, X gets you Y. You will get diminishing returns over time. And you start asking yourself, if you're a serious policymaker, okay, I'm not really getting all the public safety bang I can at this point by just putting more police officers out there. What else could I possibly do? Are there other things other than just cops, cops, cops that could address the public safety problem? I think that's a debate that we are not having, or that's a conversation that we're not having robustly enough in the country right now.
So I'm going to say something that connects to what Vikrant says, and then really take the last thing he said as a piece to move forward. So the policing project works in a number of impacted communities and always had. We've been extremely active in Chicago. There's an enormous gun violence problem in Chicago. And in those communities, as the mayor's public safety person told me once, you know, what people want is more police, not less police. Now, I think not fewer police. Now, I think in part to not only where what the options may be to more police, but that's what people ask for. And I had a conversation with the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department once, sort of until under the pandemic, when the gun violence numbers were skyrocketing. And I said, look, have you thought about moving police to the hotspots and giving them the instruction that they're to do nothing except wave at people unless they see a gun? And he thought that was nuts. But the social science actually said that we don't need the enforcement we get from the police to get the benefits of just having officers uniformed on the street. And that the police don't comprehend that. And so where the police go, you know, Vikrant said, well, the social science says we get more public safety if there are more police. But he also said, and it's so very important to understand, it depends on how you're defining public safety and whose safety you're talking about. Because police and policing brings harm with it, inevitably. And unless you're going to tackle that, public safety is a complicated concept. Which leads me to where I want to go and where the policing project has gone, which is that after I'd been doing this work for several years, another light bulb went off in my head that defines a lot of our work, which was that, you know, police often prefer to be called public safety organizations rather than law enforcement organizations. But as I rode around in police cars, as I worked in impacted communities, I didn't see that public safety happening. I actually saw a lot of the harms of policing. And I started to ask myself a question, which has become much more of a prominent question. At the time that I started to ask it and started to write about it, I literally talked to people and they had no clue what I was talking about. But now I think people do, which is, why are we using police? A lot of the reasons that people call for help in society, call 911 for help, don't require a police officer. In fact, the police officers are rarely trained for that sort of thing. Mental health issues, substance abuse issues, but it goes way beyond that. The work that we're doing looks at, you know, neighborly sound disputes, complaints about noise, animal control. There's just long lists of things that we ask the police to do. In fact, we've been on the ground in 5 cities in this country, like looking at the calls for service where we send police, where the police are not trained, they don't solve the problem. And what we really need to do is rethink response altogether, think about alternative response. And so that's something we're deep into doing. And I think for a lot of the things that we do send the police to, we can do way better as a society. Which then leaves you, by the way, with a really, really critical question, which is what is it exactly the police are going to do? Because if the answer is they're going to do a lot more stopping people and frisking people, then that's a serious worry for me.
So let me follow up on that, Barry, which is the enormous difficulty and pain that has followed the pandemic, and even before that. What we see in communities and big cities around the country is a lot of unhoused populations, tent cities that are developing, that are growing. We see the opioid epidemic. We see a huge mental health crisis. We see folks that are really, really struggling. There was a big read story in the New York Times yesterday talking about Phoenix, where tent cities have really gone up in downtown, where local shop owners, for example, are struggling enormously with the blight that has followed. And so in that context where these difficulties give rise to a lot of social issues. We talk about the mental health issues, the potential for violence, the potential for just, folks to come together in ways that cause potential difficulties between them. So how does, the response in that article was always to call the police. How does that change? Can you just talk about the process whereby we can lead to a different response that actually has outcomes to solve these issues? Because it didn't feel like that cycle of sort of calling the police and dealing with it was having any results.
Yeah, I saw the article about Phoenix, but I actually, before winter break, spent time in Seattle and in San Francisco, and like too many cities, there's quite literally a crisis. I mean, in the Tenderloin in San Francisco and in downtown Seattle, there are tent cities. I saw people, that were clearly very strung out on drugs. One fellow attacked somebody on a bicycle. It's untenable that society exists in that way. And the point of the New York Times story was that there were, small business owners that were just closing their businesses. So what do we do? And the answer to this is not remotely easy. I view some of it as the tragedy of the pandemic and financial circumstances, certainly the influx of drugs, but also just, sometimes a failure of municipal government and a failure of trying to think about how to even tackle the problem. But the one thing I'm confident of is that setting the police isn't solving the problem. The police would be the first to tell you that. In fact, I don't know if anybody saw this, but recently the LA, I can't remember the exact name of the union in LA, but the LA Protective Officers Association identified to city council like a list of 28 things that they just didn't plan to respond to any longer, including calls about people who were unhoused. And at the same time in San Francisco, I rode around with their street outreach teams. So it was kind of a weird experience for me because I was riding in what were really fire department vehicles, not police vehicles, but it felt very much the same to me. They were uniformed people, they had radios, they were doing dispatch. So in my head, I'm in a police car. And then when I watched the teams step out to deal with the folks about whom there were calls, it was a completely different thing. It was actually, I was pretty choked up about it in some situations because it was just an entirely different approach to care. It was extremely passionate. It was designed to help get people to the resources that they need. And I think that's a direction that we need to go, though I do not want to minimize the fact that to all intents and purposes, we do not have the resources that we need to address those problems. And that's, crisis is not an overused word in this situation.
Vikrant, did you want to say anything in response to that?
Yeah, I agree with all of it, but I would also say that when I think about these problems, I have a lot of sympathy for the police officers. When they decide to go to the police academy, I don't think the kind of thing that's driving them and motivating them is, boy, I really want to go bust the guy urinating at the street corner. That's not something that gets you out of bed in the morning. And if the expectation is that you want for cops to handle all of these mental health problems, all of these domestic situations, all of these, drug abuse issues, number one, it's simply unrealistic. As Barry was saying, it's just not tenable. I also think it's a little unfair. We've just got to develop more robust entities in the rest of society that can go out and handle these kinds of problems because it is too much to ask of cops.
Okay, so I think there's too much agreement going on.
Actually, disagree. So let me, okay, you want to disagree? Okay, go ahead. I don't formally disagree that it's unfair to ask that of cops, but where I do disagree and where I actually think we need to be super thoughtful is why we have police and what it is we think they're doing. So what did they think they were going to do when they went to the police academy? And one thing I've looked at, by the way, are, you know, some of the advertisements recruiting police officers, and it's actually gotten very difficult to recruit police officers right now. The police departments are being effectively defunded because they can't hire. But, you know, you look at those advertisements and because some of them, you know, they're kind of warm, fuzzy scenes where the police officers are helping somebody with something. And some of them, the police are basically like rappelling out of helicopters and down the sides of buildings. And you know, there isn't much of that going on really in policing, but there's plenty of force and fast cars and all of that. And what you have to stop and think about is actually what is it that the police are accomplishing in society? So one thing, for example, that you may, you know, I ask people all the time, what should police do? And they always say, well, deal with violent crime. And I say, well, what do you mean? You know, most of the time when somebody calls 911 about a serious crime, the responders never get there when the crime is in progress, almost never arrive when the crime is in progress. And after the crime has occurred, what you need are victim services, you need good forensics, you need a variety of things that you're just not going to get from police as we now understand them. And then the other thing that I think we ask police to do to deal with violent crime is a lot of proactive policing, which involves pedestrian stops, traffic stops. And there's plenty of evidence that that doesn't work. And so sometimes I think the problem is that policing itself has just not figured out what is successful in addressing crime. And we're left with the quandary then about what is it precisely that police do in society. Now, Vikrant's right. Uniformed police on the street are a deterrent to people committing acts of crime, but they can't be there all the time. And so, you know, it just raises profound questions about, like, I feel sorry for the cops too, but, you know, it's not clear to me what should be happening.
So let me ask this, Vikrant mentioned that, and you mentioned that it's difficult to recruit police these days. So I want to ask a question that may surface some disagreement. I'm not sure, actually. I don't know what both of you think about this, but certainly one of the proposals that's been made is in front of Congress right now, but has gotten nowhere, is abolition of qualified immunity for police officers. And also possibly abolition of the custom and policy defense for municipalities. The qualified immunity defense immunizes police from civil liability for any action which has not been identified in the Supreme Court precedent as unconstitutional. And the policy and custom defense immunizes municipalities unless they have an unconstitutional custom and policy. So keeping weapons against the police, I find it fairly hard to get redressed, solely speaking. So what do you two think about abolishing qualified immunity defense, getting rid of the policy and custom defense? Some people would argue that if we don't have qualified immunity, no one's going to want to be a cop because they're going to be just scared of civil liability. Other people think we've got to get rid of that because it's otherwise police can be legal. So I don't know who wants to start with that. Ron?
You know, so I'll say right off the bat, I would support, you know, broadly getting rid of qualified immunity. I just find it implausible that yeah, I don't know, Barry, maybe there'll be a lot of agreement here too, but let me try and fill out my reasons, and maybe you'll at least disagree with the reasons. But number one, I just don't think that young men and women who are interested in becoming police officers are really thinking about qualified immunity policies and analyzing that and saying, oh gosh, well, you know, I'm not going to become a police officer because I could get in trouble in this way. I really think they're looking at the pay and the pensions and, you know, just day to day what happens on the job, that kind of thing. That I just find it very difficult to believe that that's what folks are thinking about. I also think, by the way, that if you got rid of qualified immunity, I'm actually not sure that it would do that much on a practical level to hold that many police officers accountable. I think, you know, insurance companies step in and pay for these things. But the third point, this is why I still would get rid of it, even though I'm not sure that it would do that much on a day-to-day accountability level, is that I do think that it would inspire a lot more confidence in communities that, you know, this is discussed, the idea of qualified immunity and police officers being able to get away with things. And you notice, for example, like with we're talking in Tennessee right now, not too far away in Memphis. You had the situation, the awful killing just a few months ago. And the mayor's decision to just very quickly remove the police officers, I think inspired a certain amount of confidence in people. They don't always see this kind of thing. It feels like people, police officers, quote unquote, get away with it. They're put on paid leave or something like that. I do think that if you can change things in policy that would just inspire more confidence and trust in the system, you get a lot of benefits from that in the long run.
Yeah, so I want to shout out Joanna Schwartz's excellent book, Shielded. Joanna's been on a book tour about it, and it really takes apart the problem of qualified immunity. And I and Joanna and some other lawyers have filed many petitions in the Supreme Court asking them to take qualified immunity cases, and they have not done that because I think the court has no clue what to do about qualified immunity. Like Vikrant, I'm not sure that solving the qualified immunity problem would change much. Joanna's research shows that officers rarely pay, and even when they are made to pay, they're indemnified by their employer or by insurance companies. I unequivocally think that the rules around municipal liability need to change. I unequivocally believe that when police officers cause harm, there needs to be redress and that needs to be recognized. I find it astonishing that municipalities pay out hundreds of millions of dollars year after year and do not translate that into changing the way that policing happens and insurers do the same. And so, my focus and the focus of our work is very much there, which is why is it that we continually pay out millions of dollars rather than pouring those resources into making policing itself better? And that I find to be both perplexing and a travesty.
Chris, can I mention one little follow-up? I love telling this story. I want people to understand how important it is that people, because I've said this so many times, that people have faith and some level of trust in the institution and in the laws. There's this terrific body of scholarship out there about something called procedural justice. And there are two fantastic scholars, Tom Tyler and Tracy Mears, both of whom I know that both of you know at Yale, who've done a lot of work on this. And the basic idea is, why are people obeying the law? And the simplistic answer is, well, they're afraid of getting caught. But that's not all of it. A lot of why people obey the law is because they think the law is credible and that it's worth obeying. And the way that I will sometimes communicate this teasingly to a lot of my conservative friends is early on in the pandemic, deep into the pandemic, I would go to events from time to time in Washington, D.C., for example, where there were mask mandates. And all of my conservative friends in the audience simply would not wear the mask. They would say, this is silly, this is ridiculous. And it was because they just did not have a lot of confidence in the law. They didn't have a lot of confidence in the city council or the mayor or whoever was passing these laws. And setting aside what you think of that behavior, I would say to my conservative friends, do you understand how there are a lot of people in society who look at the government making the laws, who think about the laws, look at the individuals and say, I just don't find these folks credible. And you understand how crime can kind of stem from that kind of an attitude. And if you get it, if you yourself are doing it, you should get it. And you should care a lot about ultimately creating a system that people have trust and confidence in.
Okay, I'm going to try again to create a little controversy here. What about the role of the federal government in all this, in terms of pursuing reform and perhaps even coercing reform? So Barry and I were involved in a document where we suggested the federal government should be involved in setting standards for police practices, for setting up national databases that take into account and tabulate police use of force, police decertifications of officers who've been in trouble. And we also talked about using the power of the purse to get local and state police moving in the right direction in terms of police reform. Should the federal government be involved in that? Can the federal government be involved in that kind of activity? And I'll throw in here also comment about consent decrees, which have had great success around the country. That's the federal government basically imposing a set of rules on police departments to try to get them to change in a fundamental way. Not always very successful. Once again, that's the federal government being involved in It's one often resisted by police unions, among other things, and that's not always successful. So what do you think about federal involvement? Barry, you want to start with that?
I do, and I actually want to start by addressing your frustration that Vikrant and I are agreeing. So Vikrant and I come at the world from dramatically different ideological perspectives that I think we agree on. And we agree about a lot of what needs to happen here. And the problem is that we live in a society that is driven by, at some level, just ridiculousness. And so we're all like off in our corners having ideological fights that often bear no relationship to reality. Policing is one of those areas. And so, you know, you're pro-police, you're anti-police, and you're in your position, and you're just stuck there. When in fact, if you just out and thought, I'd like to fix the problem, there are a lot of fixes, and there are a lot of things that we should be doing, and it's hard to do them because of the outer silly conversation. So you've just stepped into another one. So it just so happens that I and Rachel Harmon at UVA and Farhan Hidari, who's going to be an assistant professor here beginning in the fall, and was
Take his course.
who's going to be teaching Crim Pro, and who was the executive director of the policing project, have just placed an article in the UVA Law Review entitled "The Federal Role in Local Policing." So, you know, you say, what should the federal government's role be in local policing? And a bunch of people are going to jump up and say, federalism. Like they can't, or they can use the spending power and try to encourage it, but they can't make local agencies do anything. Well, first of all, it's wrong that they can't make local agencies do anything. Congress has power under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It could make policing agencies do a lot if it built a record, which would not be a hard record to build, about uses of force and racial discrimination. It's just afraid to do that for political reasons. But beyond that, this notion that the federal government has to come in like Bigfoot and make local policing agencies do things, which there are many that I think it should, misunderstands the situation. There are 18,000 policing agencies in the United States. At least that's what our best count is. And a lot of them need help, need serious help. They lack the resources to actually police in effective ways. They lack the knowledge about how to police in effective ways. A lot of the tragic police shootings that you see happen in small bedroom communities that are very poor outside of major metropolitan areas, and the police are inadequately trained. And there's a lot that the federal government could and should do to step in and try to make policing better, and it should not be so shy about that. And we say that in pretty strong terms in the article.
I'll push back a tiny bit. One of my my favorite movie lines is in Jurassic Park. Jeff Goldblum is hearing about, you know, what the scientists have done to recreate these dinosaurs at this amusement park. And he says, I think your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think about whether or not they should. So I'm actually going to reverse that, Chris, and say that your question about, you know, should the federal government be involved is so preoccupied with whether or not the federal government should, it doesn't address whether or not they can. I think it is extremely difficult because, as Barry said, there are 18,000, as far as we know, different policing entities out there. I guess I'm not in principle so opposed to the federal government trying to do something to create uniform standards, but I just have my doubts about how possible that is. You know, we have urban and rural and suburban areas, all of which are, you know, that doesn't just mean that there are three broad types. And even within that, there are just so many different kinds of communities with different kinds of demographics and different kinds of geographic layouts. It is very, very complicated. I think if anybody can put something together that would be useful, it would be Barry and his team. But I do wonder just how far that could realistically go. It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, I want to ask one last question, and we want to leave 15 to 20 minutes for your questions. So get ready to ask them. And this is a question about police use of technology. I mean, police have had computers for quite some time, but lately they've been very excited about using things like automated license plate readers and facial recognition technology and drone cameras. And they've been accessing location data from common carriers, and they've been scraping social media and using data brokers to get lots of personal information. So I'm curious what Virtue's attitude is about this development. Is it something that's good because it's making policing more efficient, or is it way too intrusive? What kind of regulation should we impose on these kinds of police efforts?
Sure. So I do a lot of my writing in this space. Yesha and I are actually working on a paper now because when government creates, I'm going to talk about CBDCs, even though Yesha's taught me everything I know, but when we have central bank digital currencies, which is crypto, but issued by the government's going to have to keep track of who has that money, and in fact, the government's going to have the capacity to where you're spending every dollar, and that scares the hell out of me. I hate license plate readers. I loathe them. So license plate readers do what they say they do. They're little cameras that record where cars have traveled, and they're used in two ways. One way is that they're used to compare to a hot list. Is there a stolen car that just passed this camera? I'm okay with that within reason, though I'm not when those cameras are used to engage enforcement for people that have unpaid fines and fees. But the other thing that happens with license plate readers is they just suck up everybody's location data. I don't want the government to know where everybody is at all times. It terrifies me. And I don't know what Friedman's about to say, but I hope that, like a good conservative that he is, he's actually going to be as worried as I am about the government possessing all this information. But it's just happening willy-nilly. There's no regulation pretty much at all of any of this. And the police who are mission oriented, they have vendors who come to them and say, look, I've got a magic tool. I can keep track of everybody, which, by the way, I think if we really want to do that, we should just install RFID chips in all of our arms, and then we could be done with it. And we would know where everybody was at every moment of the day. But if not, we got to regulate it. Regulating it's hard. It's complicated. We started down a path of, well, let's regulate drones. Let's regulate license plate readers. But it can't be that you're going to set up a regulatory scheme for every single technology. And so what we really need is some kind of omnibus legislation that thinks about the collection of data and its storage. I'm playing with an article about something called data trusts, which is a way that the information is available to the government, but there are a huge set of protections and trustees that decide when the government can have access to that information. But whatever the solution, I try to tell people that are very concerned about the use of force by the police, racial discrimination by the police, that they're right. But pretty soon we're going to get a lot less use of force because the police aren't going to need to use force because they're just going to know where everybody is all the time. And that we should be as concerned about that, which, by the way, I can assure you is going to be raised in exactly the same way. Street policing is what we should be focusing on.
I have complicated thoughts on all this. One is uncomplicated, which is that I don't like all the storage of data. As Barry said, I have very strong libertarian tendencies. And so a lot of that creeps me out. But as far as, suppose you could solve that problem, suppose, I don't know, police departments, governments were required in very short order to just purge themselves of the data they have in some theoretical way. How do I feel about the use of technology? I don't know. I'll give one really specific example that I have mixed feelings on. I think at a broad level, it would be better if we had fewer unnecessary police-civilian contacts, because some percentage of them are going to become antagonistic and go bad, and you're going to have some kind of police violence incident. So I kind of feel like if we can structure society in a way to just have fewer of those conversations happening in the first place, it'd probably be good. Now, having said that, I live in a community with a lot of these cameras that will catch your car if you are speeding. And I personally have received quite a few of these notices in the mail that you now have to pay $200 or whatever because I was going 10 miles per hour above the speed limit on K Street. And they drive me nuts. And something feels so impersonal and robotic and anonymous about the fact that I don't think I was doing anything wrong. And all of a sudden I've received my sixth or seventh notice in the mail about this bizarre infraction. There's a little picture and I ask myself, well, you're really going to stick to your guns on this position that you don't want police-civilian communication? Wouldn't it be better if there was some face attached to the government? Wouldn't you have a little bit more confidence in the system? I don't know if I would or I wouldn't, but I know that these tickets drive me crazy. There's something about the impersonality about it that just feels terrible. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who feels this way.
What drives you crazy is the personality and not the sum of money you're paying the government.
Because that's what procedural justice says. Is that people feel better about enforcement if the cop listens to them and gives them the chance to interact. And I guess I've always been skeptical. It's like would you rather like the rude cop who lets you go or the really sweet cop that gives you a $200 ticket? And You just don't know how to do the cost benefit on that exactly.
Oh, it's a totally fair point. If a cop came up to me and said, well, tell me why you were speeding, sir. And I said, well, my kid has a doctor's appointment, whatever. And he said, okay, I understand, but I got to write you this ticket, right? Would I really be happier? I'd probably just be just as irritated.
Mind if I stop speeding? Okay. Take some questions from the audience.
And the Zoom, sorry, yes, the Zoom also. I guess we'll see that on chat. Is that how that works?
Jenny's manning our Zoom
Okay.
chat, yep. So everyone on Zoom, please feel free to ask your questions. We'll do one in the room and one in the Zoom.
So, sorry, one of the.
Do you, second?
Okay, thank you. So one of the reforms that has been proposed is to change the police education requirements upfront. And if that's something that you support, I'm curious, understanding that police are often thrust into these like mental health or animal control, all these varied roles. What do you, even when they probably shouldn't be, what do you think that education reform should look like if we change what kind of training they're doing upfront?
So first, just on the data, there's plenty of evidence that officers who have degrees, college degrees, tend to be better officers and use force less often. By the way, there's plenty of evidence that women police officers are much more successful at resolving issues without force. And we have an initiative at the Policing Project called the 30 by 30 Initiative to raise the number of women recruits in policing to 30% by 2030. So education's a good thing, but your question was more specific. And as it happens, I spent the weekend reading a memo from one of my team members. We're trying to develop what we call the moonshot internally, which is a way to train holistic responders to actually take individuals from communities. In fact, the plan that we're playing with right now involves almost an apprenticeship program where people who are in impacted communities could come in and both spend their time on the job training and then also doing in classroom training. And I would like to see responders trained in certainly mental health and dealing with people who are in mental health crisis and substance use. But also, one of the things that police need the most that they're not trained in is mediation skills. And Dayton is the only city I'm aware of that actually has mobile street mediators. And so, my dream, I've written about this. I wrote an article called Disaggregating the Policing Function, and I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal shortly after George Floyd was murdered, is that we have these kind of holistic responders. The model I think of is emergency room doctors, who, if you think about it, are specialist generalists in the sense that emergency medicine is what they do, which requires them to know a little bit about a lot of different kinds of medicine. And I actually think that if we put those kinds of responders out on the street, we could resolve a lot of the problems that lead people to call 911 without the bad outcomes that we get.
Vikrant, anything to say to that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, but I don't have a good answer to it. It is true, like Barry said, that there's a lot of strong evidence to suggest that better educated police officers are able to resolve these conflicts without resorting to force as quickly. But we're not entirely sure why. I mean, is it because you learned something that went inside your brain that just made you so much better at this? Or is it simply because you're older? I mean, if you tell me that a 23-year-old is better at resolving conflicts without becoming a hothead than a 19-year-old, I would say I don't need a study to tell me that. That seems totally obvious. Now, you might say, okay, well, who cares why it works? If we know with certainty that it works, then let's just do it. Let's just establish a lot more of these requirements. That's a little complicated because I could argue that policies like that have a racially disparate impact and that you get fewer minority police officers under such a policy. It's possible. And if it is true, which it might be, I'm not as familiar with the scholarship, but if it is true that people have more trust in policing as an institution, if they see a lot more police officers who look like them out on the streets, that might be too high of a cost to pay. So those are all the kinds of things that we need to think about, although I don't have a final conclusion.
Nothing on Zoom right now.
So far, nothing. Come on, Zoom people.
Chris?
I saw,
Oh, sorry.
one question here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I actually have a couple questions. First off, thank you guys for coming today. I really enjoyed the conversation. First actually goes to the first question. I guess comparatively, we know that United States police officers, their training is quite inadequate compared to other countries. And my first question is, I wonder what type of changes can, I guess, officers can go through to, I guess, put us up to par with our other country or colleague countries where they have far less deadly interactions with police. And then my second question has to do with, I come from a historically red state, and I guess up until recently, we've seen movement towards more criminal justice reforms like Vanderbilt initiatives, but I think we've seen some of that retreat recently. What type of policies can be implemented in more conservative states that we could, I guess, pass in those states state legislatures?
Vikrant, you want to jump in or should I?
Why don't you go first, Barry?
So we have a legislative initiative and we have drafted laws, model statutes that govern the use of force, that govern the creation of databases that decertify officers, that limit or ban pretextual traffic stops, that remove obstacles to disciplining officers, the sort of Leo Boers legislation, Law Enforcement Bill of Rights, and data and transparency. One thing, by the way, that the federal government can and should do is insist that every jurisdiction collect and retain and make public demographic information on enforcement actions, who's being subjected to enforcement actions. I find there's no excuse for not having done that. You ask a good question, which is, the country drives me nuts. It's like the headline is police violence, and all of a sudden we want to move toward reform. Then the headline is crime rates going up, and all of a sudden we want to step back in the other direction and get tough on crime. Instead of being smart about things and deciding what would be a sensible policy direction and then just sticking to it, because there are always going to be salient headlines in every single direction. But you're right that the kinds of things that we're finding interest in our legislative initiative are shifting because of as the narrative shifts. And so, for example, there's a lot of interest in the use of force legislation. And in the Leo Boers legislation, now there's less, but there's more interest in data and transparency and measures that seem like that, or decertifying officers that have been fired because of misconduct. And interestingly, a spike in interest in laws governing pretextual traffic stops after the murder of Tyree Nichols. So, and I think that's absolutely critical that we focus on stopping pretextual traffic stops that accomplish almost nothing but endanger the officers, individuals, and others.
So we have a Zoom question. Oh, Vikrant, did you want to answer? I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's say, I had some things I want to say, but if we have more questions, let's jump into them.
I think it's Tom, Mr. Schiphol. Would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hello, thank you. Tom Scheipel. I'm joining from Massachusetts. I'm wondering if you think if community advisory boards have a useful role to play in suburban communities. And here I'm thinking specifically of like a group of residents who, for example, review and suggest policies and review policing data. And finally, do these community advisory boards, which is a well-known concept in the industry, do you feel that these are actually a good thing for police departments themselves? Thank you.
Barry, that is a pitch right over the plate to you. Why don't you take that question?
So we have studied and written a great deal about what are sometimes called police advisory boards, sometimes called civilian review boards. I want to draw a really critical distinction. And I know Nashville has an oversight board that I think crosses this line that I'm about to describe. So there's a lot of calls when things go wrong for civilian review boards, and civilian review boards are often civilians, though I don't like that word civilian because I think it kind of puts us in a military posture to police, review disciplinary decisions that are made about police officers. And those boards are astonishingly ineffective. And so it's something that people yell about wanting to have, but they don't accomplish very much. In fact, very often they are inclined to impose less discipline than police chiefs are inclined to impose. There are advisory boards and oversight boards that have front-end authority to advise on or demand that the police policy be a certain way. So we helped draft legislation in Chicago for their Community Commission on Public Safety and Accountability, which is a front-end board that will set policy for the Chicago Police Department. I'm wildly in favor of those boards, but they are expensive and take a lot of training. And then there are advisory boards like you just asked about, and we published a paper about this. They have potential, but usually they don't achieve much because they're set up at a moment of crisis by the police chief. Gets to be the same usual suspects on the board. There's not enough pushback in terms of what the department is doing. And so they can be helpful, but it just depends on the structure in which they're operating.
Chris?
All right. So first, thank you all for coming and thank you for the conversation. And I do have two questions. So the first one is that you briefly mentioned like having like more police presence in like hotspots to kind of like, stop people from thinking about like bad things. So basically, I think this is a good idea, and I'm just wondering what are the primary obstacles? It's like people worrying about their surveillance by the government, surveillance by the police. So that's the first question. And the second question is that has anyone ever thought about the diversification of like the police force? That's saying like we do have like some certain units to deal with the things like say like mental health crisis, some kind of like some substance abuse problems, and some units kind of like dedicated to, let's say, do like traffic problems, and some units do like violent crimes. So why is that not a good idea, or why is that not considered yet? Thank you.
Vikrant, you want to take the first one on hotspots since you started?
Yeah, let me take the first one. I mean, it's a really neat question. It's a really interesting thing we should dig into. This question of why, putting more cops out on the street works is really important. For a long time, I think what we thought would be an effective model in this country was just to enhance punishments, right? Well, make the penalty longer, tell people they're going to go to prison for a longer amount of time. And that just does not comport with the way human nature works, I think. People are not, doing the mathematical calculation in their head. Well, if I'd committed this carjacking last year, it would have been 5 years behind bars, but I checked the statute code and now it looks like it's up to 10 years. I better not do that. I mean, that's not the way people think. People are just thinking, in the moment, am I going to get caught? And so if it seems like there's a lot of cops out there just walking around, you're probably that's probably a big part of what's happening here, is that people are just afraid of getting caught in the moment. And so that's why that flood the zone strategy works, again, up to a point. But you ask, well, why can't we just do more and more of this? And I said in some of my remarks earlier in the panel that you get diminishing returns. And part of why you get diminishing returns is that good cops don't just grow on trees. We have this tendency in the country to say, well, let's solve this problem in healthcare with more doctors and more nurses. Or let's solve this problem, in our mental health system with more social workers. Let's solve this problem in criminal justice with more cops. These are very sophisticated and difficult, challenging professions. And the idea that there's just some magic bucket out there where you just pull people from and put them out there, it's not quite that simple. That's why you've got to experiment with different ideas beyond just get more cops out there. At a certain point, it's simply not realistic anymore.
As to the second question, so there are a lot of different police units and special trainings. And ironically, one of the most famous for dealing with people in mental health crisis is the Memphis model. That, unfortunately, Memphis has not fully implemented its own model and been attentive to that. The question you need to ask, though, is why the police are doing it at all. So for a lot of these special units, why do we think that somebody who is armed with as somebody else pointed out, very inadequate training that we give police officers in this country is the right solution to some of these problems? Now, you might say, because there's the threat of harm, of physical harm. And that's true in some number of cases. And what we really have to do is do a better job at dispatch, at triaging those calls and figure out which ones lead to that. But lots of jurisdictions have set up mental health response units that are responding without the police. Police are on call if they need them and doing quite well. And that is going to be the future. And we're going to have a future in which there are individuals trained in all these other things that are responding other than the police. So that's just the direction in which we need to look.
So we got one last question off of Zoom, and I'll just read it. And you all can read it too. How can the political noise about police reform be reduced? So to make possible more unified efforts toward police reform and training. I think we've shown here that we can reduce a lot of the political noise, but I guess the question is, how can we do it countrywide?
I was going to let Vikrant answer that because I think you could have just asked the question, how can we reduce the political noise? And I don't have an answer to that question. So
Yeah. I don't know that I have an answer to it either. Can we get someone to buy Twitter and accidentally destroy it? Can we file lawsuits that bankrupt major news corporations? I don't know what we can do to reduce the political noise. I will say this, though. Leading up to 2020, there was a lot of really good criminal justice reform. An earlier questioner from the audience was asking about what we can do in red states. And what I wanted to say was, we have done a lot of great things in red states. And I'm proud to say that I was a part of a lot of those efforts. There were major criminal justice reform packages that, reduced the use of incarceration in states like Texas in 2007 and states like Georgia in 2011, I think it was. I could go on and on talking about South Dakota and Mississippi and all these places. A lot of that stuff dried up in 2020, and it dried up because crime rates started to go up. And I think there were some people making the argument that, well, maybe it went too far. Maybe all this stuff is counterproductive because it's resulting in crime rates going up. I think that is ludicrous. And I think it's ludicrous because the crime rates were going down and arrest and incarceration rates were going down year after year after year until all of a sudden something happens in 2020. And I find myself asking, well, gosh, what in the world happened in 2020 that was so unusual or different in this world? The answer is obviously, it's obviously COVID. And I would also say, by the way, it's the death of George Floyd and the protests that followed George Floyd. Now, depending on whether you're on the left or the right, there are different things that you would point to as the majority of the explanation. I think a more conservative person might say, those protests in the wake of the Floyd killing were counterproductive, and they caused police officers to be less aggressive in their work and make crime go up. That's part of it. Someone on the left might say about the policing protests, well, this is a real demonstration of lack of trust in institutions. People stopped cooperating with police officers and calling them. You could look at COVID. Somebody on the left might say, well, gosh, people just kind of got really upset during COVID. There was a lot of, people who needed mental health services and things like that weren't able to get them. People on the right might say, as a result of COVID, we closed all the schools for too long. And so all the young men were out on the streets getting into trouble when they could have been in after-school programs or something. There are just a million different directions to take this. And depending on your political background, you might emphasize one explanation or another. But what I think ought to be clear to everybody, regardless of their political background, is that these criminal justice reforms were very effective, and we're not increasing crime rates for really over a decade. So we can do those things. We have done those things. If we can find a way to bring the political noise down, I think we can go back to continuing to do them and doing them in red states also.
So with that, I think that was a phenomenal way to end. Thank you. Zoom, and thank you all for coming. This was a wonderful conversation.